Hello everyone, today we talk about the origin of the use of the term Ministeriales to describe the German and free knighthood between the 11th and the 13th century roughly. It's a topic that we began to look in detail now from some time. We will make a lot of videos on, and that is quite important for a number of reasons. So today's topic is fundamentally based on a vocabulary matter, right, that naturally reflects also political, social, and military reality. So you may ask, but what do we care? Like how they used the term ministeriales in the sources to define more or less we understand what these people were, also from a broader historiographical perspective. Yes, but it is important to stress why and how, but to define better, right? To add a bit of of paint to color better this figure that is quite fascinating, as the Ministeriales, as you know, would become probably by number the larger typology of knight properly in medieval Germany in these centuries, especially in the south of the country, where up to 90% of the knights were fundamentally of unfree servile status, and that, as we will see also from the list of sources today, was a phenomenon that had a great fortune among ecclesiastical lordships and their military retinues, for reasons that today we can't digress on, but we already made a video on the German Ministeriales. So if you simply search for Schwerpunkt Ministeriales, you will find that. Otherwise, there is the medieval Germany playlist or the medieval knighthood playlist. You'll find them either way. So this is important because in Latin, ministerialis has a specific meaning, right? And the fact that the term came to define a specific social group in this German reality, something can be observed fundamentally through, starting from the 11th century mostly, but also a bit from earlier sources altogether. In the empire, broadly meant, also since Carolingian times, as we will see that the term was fundamentally late Roman. It mostly stemmed from administrative vocabulary. And the amount of evidence that starts emerging in low medieval Germany about these properly status, right? It's not a typology of fighter. These guys were fundamentally knights like anybody else. And they came to be also stratified, like some of them by the 13th century especially had become more powerful than the same free noble knights. Sometimes there is an interesting distinction, in fact, that emerges also in here from sources that are not very categorical about that, because sometimes they have problem to represent a more shaded reality than the one it seemed. Especially because the status was different, but the military expertise was fundamentally the same. So it can be misleading, right, to search for ministerialis in the sources, especially starting from the 11th century, and say, okay, well, we find the term, so it means that kind of unfree knight in Germany that was rising as, you know what the dynamic behind it was, right? Since these people were unfree, and Germany at large had an unfree population, in the sense that in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, generally the majority of people had grown framed under someone's lordship, right? This was different from other areas of Europe. It was somewhat average, especially in post-Carolingian realities, but not everywhere, where there are substantial exceptions, even within the same Holy Roman Empire, but this is another thing. This is also another important thing to reflect on, right? To understand properly why in Germany this characteristic of the knight emerged compared to the other countries, right? This aspect of the general dependency of somebody, right, as properly in terms of personal connection, was quite strong. So much that, as we will see, the term was also used, ministerialis, literally, for indicating actually freemen that were, however, bound to some lords that, in a form of almost unescapable link. And we have to stress that the label ministerialis prevailed as the scribal norm over several other descriptions for the same kind of person quite late in the day, right, at the beginning of the 12th century. And even in there, wouldn't be universal, right? So in the 11th, they were just, making technical proofs in lexicon to define better this typology of servant that, as you understand, had been born also in Germany, as for other areas in Europe, as and known as Ministeriales for many of mansions that the lords entrusted to people, to their subjects fundamentally, and reason for which some of these people originally were not connected to the military function, and still the term in fact defined sometimes some civilians, we could say, as we will see, and properly servants of the lower order, right, which is different already from a knight that, I don't know, he's garrisoning a castle scattered, somewhere in Thuringia, right, that might have not lived in a, in a very privileged way, which surely had a higher dignity, socially speaking, than, maybe the average freeman that in practice, however, was somebody's serf. So, as we were saying before, the term ministerialis in itself has a long story, right? And it surely did not originate as a description for a knight, right? This term stems from late Roman sources, right? For and designating the officials of Roman emperors, specifically in the administration. This was used in a parallel sense by the Carolingian and Ottonian scribes that were reviving a bit also the broader, respectively, especially the Latin, linguistical property and the the political institutional frame of the Roman Empire. So it was not even indicating a legal status as such, but simply an office, a service, the ministerium, right, of all kinds. The etymology in Latin should be known. It's the same of our administrator, that in that, with the addition of 8, defines specifically those who are deputed to ad minus, which means to the lesser thing. So administrator is literally the guy who carries out the most practical work, whereas somebody else took the decision in virtue of his own superior state authority, etc. It's a deep concept that has to do, and we will see it also when talking about German knighthood, specifically to a double connection of duty and reward, as munus in Latin fundamentally means the same thing. And this is very important when you speak of medieval servitude. We have seen it also in other contexts, like among the Mamluks, for example. There is this idea of servilus, slave, but factually they were often, because of their bond to their masters, actually better off people and with kind of a higher de facto status than their juridical condition would otherwise show. Even the nobility, ecclesiastical and lay alike, could be called ministeriales for this reason, because they were fundamentally at the service of the king, of the emperor, right? We find in the 90s of the 10th century the Emperor Otto III's faithful Count Sigebert called as a ministerialis, right? Because it was stressing here properly as the role of mansioneer, right, of the emperor in that case. It could fit at every step of the political ladder. So before the 11th century, ministerialis definitely did not refer to what in the Eastern Frankish kingdom would come to refer to the knight of unfree birth, but to anybody, basically, often actually of high rank, right, who performed an office for a monarch or a prelate, as we will see, and we have already highlighted how much ministeriales were popular among the episcopal retinues, and how much also German armies were properly made up of these people, and even properly the ones that, I don't know, in Hohenstaufen's times, made up the armies of the Raumfahrt in Italy were often ecclesiastical contingents, and there was a very high quota of unfree knights, whereas, there were surely also other knights of free birth in the nobility and so on, right? But eventually, properly from a numerical point of view, by the 13th century, it would come to be the majority. And there was also, we will see it in other videos, a specific... it's no coincidence that this transformation occurred at not just an episcopal, but also at an imperial level. It was a bit like the free cities of the empire. Like these were people who were seen as properly just as a possession of that specific... Well, okay, the free cities were something else, of course, but they were fundamentally... they had a power was delegated directly from the emperor, right? So being, great bishops, especially the ones of the Rhineland, were very supportive generally of imperial rule for political institutional reasons, etc. Or the emperors, Ministeriales, meant to be literally... in comparison to the nobility, a nobody, but still a nobody that had the best connection ever, right? And that could therefore be used, as we often see, by monarchs to actually counter the power of nobility. And in the Holy Roman Empire, that would be dramatically evident, especially by the 13th century, where public authority was fundamentally going downhill, and the same monarchs resumed fundamentally to a privatistic policy, not different from the rest of the princes, making extensive use of these figures that also flocked, right? There is all a transformation. Literally, these people could be deported at the Lord's will. We know it. We will see it from a place to another of Germany, whatever. They had simply to move and sometimes to change their life and having important. They paid each other sometimes through Ministeriales. There was an interesting, properly market at some level of this band. And eventually, their gentrification, the fact that they were entrusted ever more important estates, etc., would make them fundamentally, as we've seen before, even more powerful than most free knights out there, in some cases at least. But in previous times, there are, as we were saying here, where it was different. Linguistically, in terms of vocabulary. For example, the Chamberlain Degenberg was called Ministeriales in 928. And he was a free vassal, especially from 2 years later. There is a late use of Ministeriales that tended to exalt officials of this kind, right? This, for example, is still to be found in the 11th century at the time of the Bishop Werner of Merseburg, whose brother Morico, that was Henry IV seneschal, was properly called a Ministeriales. And here we're talking actually of the illustrissimi, of the highest nobility, right? So people that were born free, as basically nobody else, in the social landscape. It were still used in, there is some kind of maybe antique taste in the sources. We'll see there are, there is not a fixed, standardized use also the same terms, but we can identify different, different stages in the interest of time. So, in fact, by the 11th century, this original use of the term ministeriales was dying out, right? And this is the moment where German scribes were using to define it ever more often to designate the famous knights of unfree status. Why not stressing properly the military, the knightly aspect? Well, in part, as we'll see, they would, but it would create an ambiguity because the Milas, that was the universal term for knight in the Middle Ages, that, as we've seen, it's also a synonym of equus at some point, but with the important distinction of the idea that the Milas will become ever more defined as a sort of privileged class and ever more detached from the rest, also properly of the mounted fighters, was not proving satisfactory, right? To define, to properly separate in terminology those knights that were free and those who were unfree, right? The freeborn knights were, in fact, specifically defined as liberi or ingenui, as in Latin it means. Ministerialis was starting to be more effective than Milas. In 1058, for example, Bishop Gundekar of Eichstätt visited the canons at Herrieden with a following of, quote, Militas, right? And the source states that there were all men of freeborn condition. It was important to stress because it made a difference of who these people were compared to the Ministeriales proper. The same term Milas at this point in the Eastern Frankish kingdom was normally used even to address not the average free knight, but the knight and the greatest in this sense. For example, the members of great comital or principal houses, right? Milas in this sense could also be used as a synonym for vassal. Duke Magnus Billung of Saxony was called Milas of Archbishop Adalbert of Bremen in 1066, which tells you how properly also the connection between these great noblemen was also sometimes to other men in the freest condition, but still without important bond. Same goes for Markgraf Ernest of Austria, for King Henry IV in 1074, or Count Henry of Lach, of Archbishop Siegewin of Cologne. And there are other examples like this. So one would ask, why would, since Ministerialis was actually a universally used term in Latin to define this kind of administrators, fundamentally, of clients, etc. As we will see, there are interesting shades on their functions. But would, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom specifically, rise to the fore as properly defining the knight of unfree birth, right? And especially also considering, as we have just seen, that the same counts and bishops in the empire could be defined like this. Well, part of the reason is that it didn't define by itself a particularly legal status. So early sources tended to, as we've seen, talk even about very simple people as ministeriales. Charlemagne, Capitulary de Ville, is one of the most famous ones, uses in this way. The same in Archbishop Ingmar of Rem celebrated the Ordine Palazzi, so we're properly indicating normal servants. So the term ministerialis in itself didn't distinguish properly between the greater individuals in itself and the lesser ones. So there were naturally other ways to define the big people of the kingdom in that case, but also the freer knights in a sense of, for the latter would be, as we've seen, more ambiguous. So the shift would gradually, happen because of the same semantics, same etymology of the term, right? These guys were administrators, conceived as such, right? The concept is that they were, as we've seen, entrusted with a castle, with the attached land, etc., to rule. The thing was convenient because since they were not free, they couldn't inherit this fief factually, so they could be in theory and practically, especially at this early date, removed, and they would have not taken root as the freemen. Then, especially, this is interesting because these are the centuries in which the inheritance, the direct inheritance in lineage of the fiefs was being sanctioned by the same empire at this point. By the way, so again, there would be many other terms, let's say, to define something higher than a ministerialis concept. It was a very humbling name, if you think about that. Probably was also connected in times during the 10th century, beginning of the 11th, to that idea of purification, of sanctity of the same imperial institution in parallel with the reformation of the church, etc. would be a language that stressed the attempt also to reinforce the kind of central authority that, however, in Germany never took off. So that disconnection, especially during the 11th century and all the wars that occurred, also the struggle for investitures, etc., the legitimization coming from the papacy, etc., would increase importantly this level of private private political culture in Germany of which the same Ministeriales are an embodiment fundamentally. We have, for example, a royal gift of lands to the archbishops of Salzburg in the 10th century, including this sort of Ministeriales. Probably, not knights, but average servants amongst the appurtenances. And in the founding of the new house of St. Mary at Trier in 973, Archbishop Dietrich mentioned the manual daily services of Ministeriales in the monastery. So evidently here, we're not talking about knights or fighters in general. So the term persisted, used to define these lesser, also probably civilian elements throughout all the 11th century, even into the 12th, right? Because there was no way to, say, eradicate the use from a moment to another. Sources would, literally, take their own linguistical choices, depending on many factors. But surely, as we have seen in the 12th, the term ministerialis emerges to define properly the unfree knight. By the 20s of the 11th century, Bishop Burkhard of Worms used the same term in his household ordinances for the prominent officials and lower servants alike. So here, properly, there's not even a distinction again between the two, in the social ladder, practically. Roughly around the same time, the chapter of Passau owned, quote, serfs in proprietary right who served at best, quote, like ministeriales or bailiffs. So the bailiff was also, some kind of, land official. So it was here that properly the administrative function is also still evident. So, and it reached various, various branches of the social spectrum without too much of a problem. So the narrowing in the use of the term ministerialis towards the unfree knight it's not easy to track, to distinguish properly, even after the prevalence of after 1100, and it was surely not the only term employed in these centuries. For example, the Salian chancery used terms such as serviens, cliens, and minister, as well as miles, servus, and ministerialis. So look at all these semantic shades, right? Serviens would be like sergeant, and he who serves in a way. So also, what's the difference with servus? That sounds more like a status, not like a function. Clients as a client, minister as ministry, right? Ministerialis also. This is interesting as a derivation because, of course, in Latin there is the term minister, and ministerialis is like he who, more or less belongs also to that kind of milieu of the minister in a sense, in a ministerial function that still has a hierarchy on its own, right? So scribes were beginning to couple the term milas and ministerialis, but it was still ambiguous in practice. This brings a lot of difficulties, especially when we study 11th century sources, because you cannot simply cut saying, okay, militas means the free knights, ministri also clientes as, generally speaking, as something more orientatively free, and servientes as well, especially those serving the imperial dynasty simply as freemen, right? Nor you can't properly equate them to ministeriales. And it is a problem indeed. Everything must be read in its context. And it is starting in this century to be acceptable to bet, let's say, that behind the term, the aforementioned terms, there were, let's say, it was a substantial amount of ministeriales, right? Because they start, we know from the sources in general, we know that they started appearing consistently. Some examples: the Imperial Servitors, such as Nanno, for example, was presented with his lands to Archbishop Adalbert of Bremen, or Frederick, transferring to the following of Bishop Meginbart of Freising, or Markgraf Ernest of Austria, Serviens Azzo, recipient of lands from Henry IV. Well, these sound without much of a problem, apparently, in the Ministeriales category. Because you understand that these are somebody else's men, but it's not always certain, right? For example, the Serviens Siegfried, who died fighting for Henry IV in the Saxon War, Saxon Rebellion, turned out to be a count. So the equation is not always true. Minister can be misleading in itself, as, think about the ministers properly are considered, the bishops also in the Christian cult. I mean, in the 12th century, for example, they were called like this, in fact, proper. But still, we have other examples, like the one of Provost Gerhard of Reichersberg, who wrote of Ministeriales as, quote, knights were called ministri, right? A usage that was born in contemporary charters and land gifts as well, right? Servus is also confusing in a sense, because it could be literally, as we've seen before, like, a non-freeman, but service is most preferentially like a guy, as so many that existed in that world, many more than the Ministeriales proper. And so the term could be equivocated in a source to be like the famulus, the guy, the inservient, the house, or the court. So, for example, but we have evidence also Ministeriales calling like this. The Lotharingian Milas Giselbert of Ascham was called Duke Godfrey's Servus in 1099. So this occasional use for unfree knight never actually died out, because the source may have wanted to stress properly the concept of servitude in a way, and or also different properly levels like of connection. You see, a Ministerialis wouldn't always be tied with the same intensity to a lord. So it really depends here. The sources, medieval sources in this sense, since they're not categorical, they often contain a great semantic intelligence, like we have lost, and we should be, more sensitive to it, right, to properly understand what they mean in that specific, why they, for example, remark, like in this case, some, one name, then pairing it one with another, right, to stress also a richer, enriching the description of the same connection. By the 13th century, a ministerialis would be a miles proper, right? By the 13th century, everybody knew in Germany that a ministerialis was a miles by profession, like he fought like a knight fundamentally, and he was also properly a military professional and had acquired that kind of quasi-free status. Right, also proper, so much that in the 14th century the ministerialis dies out, right? There is not properly anything like the older class of unfree knights, juridically speaking. They blended all together, but also the political, social landscape had completely changed, and not even particularly well for the same ministerialis that suffered an important crisis exactly with the moment of the rise of so-called princely German era, right? But still, in the 11th and 12th century, this pairing of milas and ministerialis created confusion, because still the free knights were called milites themselves, so there was not much of a distinction. For example, Henry IV, by the term, Henry IV's seneschal, the milas Morico, belonged to a distinguished aristocratic house, as we've seen before. Conrad III's Milas Baldwin, benefactor of Weissenhohe, in 1140, it was a monastery, was a ministerialis, right? So was Margrave Berthold of Istria's Milas Hartung of Nordhof, mentioned in the 70s of the 12th century. There are some 12th century sources avoiding ambiguity, distinguishing explicitly the proprius Milas from the Milas Ministeriales. They used to say, the proper knight as we intended, and in a full, even juridical status of freeman, etc., and this servant knight fundamentally. And it's fascinating how, however, and we've seen, especially in conjunction with these important noblemen, and that also counted dramatically on these ministeriales. They entrusted them in very important mansions. Well, the idea was still that it was important to stress, by a certain degree, a certain ministeriales were milites, right? To properly, and I presume, exactly defining the fact that these were kind of higher status ministeriales themselves, right? They were not just the average guy, paid as in the retinue to, these were people who could also take matters in their own hands, were entrusted important political, espionage, military missions, all these things. So it's important also to stress their discretion and all those values and qualities that were beginning to form the chivalric ideal as well in the process. There are other puzzling words such as serviens or minister that we were saying before. Also, client had quite a long run, right? But it's less ambiguous because it was usually used as a synonym for vassal, who obviously might have been high-born, right? The clients is, I think this entered easily into use, especially in Carolingian times, like the idea that these were the clientels of properly the big guys were important guys themselves in a sense. So that's how semantically the connection had arrived. It was the term servitor, for example, he who serves, occurring from time to time. As for the abbot of Tegernsee's distinguished ministerialis Rika of Schaftblach, but its sense was too menial, let's say. For example, the abbot of Echternach's Servitores, serfs, were the guys who worked by the day in the monastic kitchen as bakers, millers, making laundry, right, guarding the doors, gatekeepers. So they weren't knights, right? And servitores were pretty, let's say, also I imagine diminishing titles for a ministerialis as it was emerging properly. They surely weren't the guys who baked in the kitchen, right? So, and however, in the 20s of the 12th century, Arnold of Dunsling was called servitor of St. Emmeram Abbey at Regensburg, and the head of his kindred, Gebulf, was, quote, amongst the first ministeriales of this church, according to the source. So there was a hierarchy also in this. There is a connection that can be easily found also in other contexts. The other day we were making, for example, an observation about the fact that in the same France, where the knight would acquire earlier and more, and more deeply than other countries, the characteristic of the quality of noble and freeman. Still, the idea of servitude was still pretty spread still by the 11th century, right? So for example, the existence of sergeants, of servientes, the servientes armorum, these are terms that are very famous in feudal Europe and low medieval, as a lesser grade of cavalry that would be complementary on the field to the knights, also supporting them, etc. But in Germany there are cases where some charters mentioning the same persons or families over the decades show how the same concept servants was ousted later on. For example, still, however, men serving Henry III and Henry IV, such as Raufold of Schönberg in Bavaria, Ottenland of Eschenau in Franconia, and Kuhn of Arnsburg in the Rhineland, were called servientes. But in the 12th century, where we see that the ambiguity do not, however, conceal anymore the existence of a ministeriales class, the descendants of these very men, in fact, were called ministeriales, and even more, ministeriales of the kingdom, because as we were saying before, gradually ministeriality was ever more patronized by by emperors, by the great ecclesiastical lords that had an important institutional function. So there is almost a degree of public dignity attached to the function of these knights, right? At least, especially in those cases, whereas naturally in a lay private context, and especially in areas I can think, I don't know, like northeastern Germany, there would be probably much less of a development in that sense, right? There are some single cases this kind. For example, there's a dorsal note upon Henry IV's grant to Einsiedeln in 1064 that was added not later than 1100, so a few decades later at most, reading, quote, precept of Emperor Henry about the ministeriales, who in the text are called actually the abbot of Einsiedeln's ministry and the abbot of St. Gallen's servientes. So it's interesting to see how at a relatively, close date, still in linguistically somebody would fundamentally equate ministry and servientes that evidently in the charter were something different in, respectively in Einsiedeln or St. Gallen, etc., and the various, as ministeriales altogether. So formally saying de facto, that's what they are. When the Gregorian Archbishop Gebhard of Salzburg was restored in Nicene 1086, by the way, through the military assistance of his own knights, the 12th century chroniclers of the event define these knights in various terms, like milites, servitores, and ministeriales. When Count Siegehard of Burghausen was assassinated in 1104 at Regensburg by ministeriales, that also carried out these kind of things. With somewhat, we know that the most radically violent background of medieval knighthood by, sheer, psychophysical, abuse creation, let's say, because that was the process, right? The sources describe these guys as clientes, right? Ministri, and milites regis, as well as ministeriales. So you see, milites regis, here also this interesting shade reappears. The idea that these were now guys working on behalf of the, for the sovereign, right? Specific. Also, early in the 12th century, the Imperial Ministeriales at Weissenburg in Franconia were called clientes and servitores, and we know the connection there. So, as you understand, these other terms were also habitually used. There's a manuscript from Ober Alteich in Bavaria recording gifts to the monastery, speaking of, quote, worthy knights, all of them servientes. All of them are serfs. Yes, as we were saying before, knights could be literally gifts. right? Favors. They have a cost. You have to be acquainted to the fact that in the real world, human life has a price, of course. And also in writing about the household of his monastery in the 30s of the 12th century, Ortlieb of Zwiefalten employed this expression, quote, the men whom we call clientes or ministeriales, right? So here, the idea that probably the ministeriales had acquired a slightly higher status, so much that the traditional clients now could be normally attributed to vassals in general, etc., but was, now mirroring also the ministerial status, is very, very meaningful, because this is the moment in which these guys start being properly knights, like all others in actual fact, in similar terms of power, right, and of use, etc. There are also other sources, like also monastic background for the same century, defining the household knights in similar ways. For example, at Reichenau, these are defined as sons, quote, sons of the church, or domestici, that is, ministeriales. Right? This is like the domesticus is the household. It's like the huskarl, right? Etymologically speaking, the idea that these guys lived at the dependency of the monasteries. Right here, monasteries were territorial princes. Fulda, it's said in the 13th century, to have been able to mobilize 20,000 men, right? And with properly heavy cavalry, etc., many of them were ministeriales. At Ottobeuren, quote, militares, otherwise called ministeriales. This stresses a bit more the knightly connection in a military sense, right? At Roth, quote, viri militares, who are called ministeriales. This is also nice because you say vir is not homo, right? As we will see, that there are homines as well that are indicated as such. So these are important men, right? Viri, militares, right? So these are important knights, and they're called ministeriales. Vir here is also could be also semantically the equivalent to vassal by a certain degree, right? It's maybe too imprecise because, of course, there was still an important difference between what was becoming at this point also evident as, the presence of a high-born free nobility that were fundamentally the major employers of the same ministeriales, right? So it's not quite, but still, it's important how the prestige of the ministeriales was increasing, right? But still, by the 13th century, the ministeriales are often quite called homines militares, so not viri militares. So the term homo stands for like the average guy there, right? That especially in a feudal reality like Germany had become, means like a nobody, right? But still, these are homines militares, meaning that they have a, you see, homo homines in Latin still has a kind of dignity because it's the free man, right? But in a feudal reality, free men do not quite literally exist anymore, especially in a country like Germany. So it's more about the princes, the lords of the land. So these guys, like saying homines militares in this context, stands for like being the military retinue, right? Which doesn't mean that they would even have a low status, as we were saying before, factually, materially, in terms of wealth and power, also politically speaking. But they were still properly not recognized as freemen and vassals, and because they, as we will see in other videos, they properly belonged as military to another mechanism, right? That can't be paralleled in a sense to others, but still the idea of the juridical distinction was important because the same nobility that employed them needed, as we have seen, to keep it in force. There are other alternatives to ministeriales that were to wane during the 12th century, more or less, because there were some writers that had a more conservative terminology, but we can spot this kind of in a statistic way. For example, there is the late 12th century chronicle of the county of Hainaut,
by Gilles Lebert of Mons, frequently using the expression servientes and clientes still. There, as we were saying before, in less developed lands like Saxony, compared to the Rhineland or the south of Germany that were richer, right? Not surprisingly, such terminology, older terminology, more conservative terminology remained, right? Because Saxony had a lower social certification, right? And therefore, these ministeriales were probably less important, literally as a social, as a military class, than the more developed German areas. In the 13th century, the Knights of the Bishop of Hildesheim and Alberstadt, for example, were called servientes, servi famuli, or servi militares, as well as milites and ministeriales as well. So in Saxony, there is this greater stigma of the idea of serfdom, right? The servientes, servi famuli even. Family is really infamous in a sense that because it's not a bad term in meaning that they were properly part of the familia in a sense, but still the familia doesn't pertain to a very structured, articulated, complex social reality. These are like the guys that are around the local bishops as bodyguards, right? Servi militares especially sounds pretty eloquent, right? Also, still in Saxony, the Bishop of Osnabrück's Knights of Warendorf were also called ministeriales, milites, servi, and famuli or servientes indiscriminately. Even in a mighty lineage such as the one of Wolfenbüttel-Asseburg, who had served both the emperor and the dukes of Brunswick as seneschals and marshals, so these were powerful military lineages, let's say properly, were often and quite often actually called family, right? So it's not even about the level of here we described Saxony as a sort of they had important military organization themselves. It's just that properly the connection to the Lord was seen in a different way. This definitely reflected a different political and social arrangement, and often also a different political direction, as you know, compared eventually to the Saxony. Think about in comparison to Swabia, and the kind of the attritions that occurred also with the Rhineland, and so on. So as you understand, it's obvious that this is a bit a lesson in medieval vocabulary, if you want, what you can expect from the sources, and staying awake about the medieval history is basically all like this, more or less. Like you have to always contextualize what the term is used for, more than else, where it comes from, what it's describing, why, right? What is properly that the author wants to convey through the term. Right, and especially the more the variation, paradoxically, the greater the precision in a sense, because the combination of of multiple terms in a specific way may be, in fact, very, very unique and very oriented in that kind of measure. If that actually fits with the broader motivations, etc., it can surprise you how intelligent medieval sources actually were. Surely, on average, much more intelligent than us, especially in wording, in literary capacity, and in the ability of transmitting properly what mattered, right? Even in few words. That's why also these are so important. They have a higher specific weight, so semantical. So today we stop fundamentally to the second half of the 12th century, because in the Hohenstaufen era, the rise of the ministeriales is way more evident. The Hohenstaufen tries to create a national German monarchy with a central model fundamentally. They will fail, but they will strengthen in the process the importance of the ministeriales over the rest of the nobility that at that point was the main problem in the process. Hence, we were referring to the struggle with the Welfen in Saxony also, etc. And all these various terms also occur in military contexts, right? They can also be applied to men receiving substantial rewards of land, both fief and allowed. This is interesting because it wasn't just a matter of temporary grants, right? It may have been originally so, but Ministeriales could get literally an allodium, which was something that in theory could not be properly touched even by the emperor by tradition. Penalty causing properly a rebellion in the whole kingdom, because all the other nobility said, how? In fact, not even Henry the Lion would be stripped of his allodium once it was crushed by Frederick Barbarossa. Maybe they failed to centralize, in a sense, a national monarchy in Germany, but the consequences also from a political institutional culture might have been disastrous in a sense, and Germany was already pretty problematic to be put straight in discipline towards the royal authority, public authority. So surely Frederick Barbarossa knew what he was doing. And of course, the fidelity and service bond in exchange to the lords, that is always there. Henry III's charter of 1050 granting lands at Rohrbach to his own servants and chamberlain, Obbert, flourished in a sense the ethos of knighthood, because it says, quote, "Whoever of our knights and servientes serves us faithful and strenuously will receive from us a sure reward." So here there is the distinction between free knights and the Ministeriales fundamentally already laid out. But it makes you understand that the more faithful, the more performing, and here we're talking about military service, but political, loyalty was also more important, a priori, of course, would have received a sure reward, right? This is particularly important because the Ministeriales were kind of born like that, right? Was the idea that promotion, and especially because they were unfree, right? They could have this somewhat privileged channel that maybe even a freeman wouldn't have if they were under the right ruler, right? There is so much to say, even at a normal royal level. I don't know, the same Hohenstaufen were emerging from relative obscurity by a certain degree, right? Even as freemen and as noblemen, they basically rose to power because they were faithful to the Salians till the last, and so they managed to score the royal marriage that enabled them dynastically to rise to the throne. So it was a bit the normal political dialect of the time. It's obvious that these last examples, for example, are not referring to the servientes of that we have seen at St. Maximin in Trier, that work as serfs, bakers, cowherds, cooks, launderers, etc. These were properly what we later call as men-at-arms, right? These were full professionals of war. And it's interesting also how the vernacularization of the term came to be. Dienstmann, or Dienstmann at the time, which is similar, if you want, to the English equivalent Knecht or knight. Even in the same German there is Knecht, but think about the Landsknecht, and in a sense was still in that mindset of serfdom that in Germany had remained an important thing at the end of the Middle Ages, where so Ministeriales didn't exist anymore. Dienen meaning to serve, right? And so man. In fact, there were interesting quotes also relatively to this vernacular use, such as the one in the Royal Chancery mentioned before. It says, quote, "Those were called Dienstmann in German." So that it was also like a popular, people knew who the Dienstmann was in that world, right? Also in Conrad III's time there was internal Latinization of the term, that is Dinsman. So when you find these properly Latinizations, it says that the vernacular, the use in vernacular was so strong that even the official sources in Latin had fundamentally to adapt to it. So this tells you how much already at the beginning of the Hohenstaufen era, the Ministeriales was important as a thing. And for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.